Hello fellow travellers, and welcome to episode number 28 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. This is it. We've made it to the end, at least for this season. As soon as we step away from our last path, that of Julius Caesar, our deep dive on the Roman history, as well as the first season of this podcast, will come to an end. It's been an amazing journey, full of new discoveries, some frustrations, and definitely a lot more books than I've read in the past 5 years in total. In a way, I feel as if I was back in university, when history tomes were my companions every minute of every day. I hadn't realised I'd come to miss those heavy books, and I'm glad that this project has brought them back in my life, although they have been taking up quite a lot of space. It's been almost a year to the day since I started this project, and I'm grateful for it, for even if I hadn't lost my love for history, it had slightly dulled, becoming less important as other things in life took priority. This podcast gave me back the inspiration, the love I've always had for history and the past. But it also gave me the chance to share this love with all of you, my fellow travellers, and this has helped me expand my horizons and think about other new projects, which I will present to you in due course on my Instagram channel. But as much as the time for goodbyes is upon us, we still have one last path to see through and walk in its entirety. In the last episode, we had started to delve into the story of Julius Caesar. With everything that is associated to his name today, it's easy to think that he must have been a larger-than-life figure during his lifetime. We might be excused in thinking that his life must have been a series of impressive achievements, one after the other. While in a way this is true, at least concerning the second half of his life, in reality Caesar had a surprisingly normal upbringing and career, at least in the beginning. Sure, he had been hunted through the marshes of Latium by Sulla's men, well intent on getting him to give up his marriage. Yes, he had been taken prisoner by a group of pirates off the coast of Greece, entertaining them with his oratorial skills before hunting them down and killing them. But really, apart from those two slightly out of the normal experiences, Caesar's life and political career didn't diverge much from what was expected of him in that period. He had already started to manifest some talent, especially making connections, and some of his initiatives made him beloved by the people. But he had yet to enter the right stage to showcase all of his abilities. All of that was about to change, though, as Caesar finally reached the consulship in the year 59 BCE. At 40 years of age, he was neither the youngest nor the oldest Roman to ever reach consulship. And despite the drama centred on whether or not he would accept a triumph or candidate himself for the position, nothing seemed to point to any weird thing in the consulship for that year. Everyone was about to be proven wrong. Let me welcome you, my fellow traveller, to the moment when history was made. When the year of Caesar's first consulship started, he wasn't alone in the position. As it had been since the beginning of the Republic, when Brutus had kicked the last king out and reformed Rome's governing system, 2 men were elected consuls every year. And the year 59 BCE was no exception. Alongside Julius Caesar, also Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus was elected consul. And yet, history barely remembers him. The year 59 BCE has traversed the centuries as the year of the consulship of Julius and Caesar. This should tell you everything you need to know about the role, or lack thereof, that Bibulus played in his own consulship. At one point, things got so bad that Bibulus decided to resign to send a message. But the only thing his resignation did was give Caesar complete free rein to implement his own policies for the rest of the year. While Caesar had reached the position of consul, he had no intention of ruling alone, at least not behind the scenes. We all know Caesar as a destroyer, as a wild card, hell-bent in shaping the Republic to his will. We have heard stories of Caesar the tyrant, Caesar the dictator, Caesar the man who wanted to rule alone, transforming the Republic into an empire. It's not strictly true, at least not at this point. While that might have been his end goal, Caesar was intelligent enough to realize that such sudden changes, such dramatic upheavals in the power structure would not be taken well by neither the Senate nor the people. He knew he needed to work within the boundaries of the law and maybe expand some things here and there, not overturn the entire system in one night. So, officially he kept being consul, alone after Bibilis' huffy resignation, but in reality he struck a private deal with the two most important characters in Rome at the time, Pompey and Crassus. While the former was beloved by the people, the Senate, and most importantly by his soldiers, the latter was feared, but mostly had acquired a very large clientele and had quite a lot of money. With these two on board, Caesar could ensure to have all his bases covered, whether in terms of connections or money. This private alliance crossed the history as the first triumvirate. How did Caesar manage to get Pompey and Crassus to talk to each other and support him and his ideas? If you remember, those two had never seen it eye to eye, and there was a lot of bad blood running between them. Crassus especially resented Pompey, for the latter had usurped his victory over Spartacus, and even years later he didn't seem inclined to rectify the situation. Under normal circumstances, these two didn't even want to stay in the same room, let alone working together. But they were both shrewd men underneath it all, and realized what Caesar was offering could solve all their problems. Pompey had been trying to get the Senate both to assign lands to his veterans and to ratify his ruling in Asia without much success, while Crassus was trying to get the tax fee for the lands in Asia reduced by a third. In his role as consul, Caesar saw both things done and more, laying the foundation for more lucrative prices for him in the future and the undying love of the people for some of his reforms, such as the publications of the minutes of the Senate sessions in order to hold the senators accountable. In order to better cement the alliance between these two men, Pompey decided to wed Caesar's only daughter, Julia. History has a way of overstate events and characters, something which has consistently happened with Caesar's life and action. We now think that the first triumvirate was this political powerhouse of three men stopping at nothing to get things done their way. But in reality, this wasn't quite true. As I said, the triumvirate was a private alliance, no more than a pact between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, which had no true political power whatsoever. In his role as consul, Caesar did his very best to push for the reforms he and his fellows triumviri wanted, but he was still susceptible to the opposition of the Senate. And there was no one more opposed to him than Marcus Porcius Cato. Known as Cato the Younger or Cato Uticensis to separate him from his very famous great-grandfather Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder or Cato the Censor, he was a conservative Roman senator during the last years of the Republic. He was very much focused on the preservation of what he considered old traditional Roman values. He was quite a famous orator, and his scrupulous honesty and traditional views gave him quite a following, and put him in the opposite camp of people like Caesar and Pompey. Cato had already proven himself to be quite a hindrance for Caesar's plans during the entire debacle for the consulship. Had Cato not pushed the Senate towards a refusal, Caesar might have been allowed to present his candidacy for the role in absentia. And even during the year of Caesar's consulship, he did everything in his power to stop some of Caesar's most outrageous proposals, thus highlighting just how little political power the first triumvirate really wielded. Still, Caesar managed to bulldoze through the opposition, and just as the consulship was about to end, he set up a good deal for himself for the following 5 years. First, he got rid of his political adversaries, like Cato and Cicero, sending them both out of Rome. And then he managed to persuade the Senate to give him command of Gaul for 5 years. The Senate, wanting to be rid of Caesar and remove him from Rome, granted it to him. They couldn't have known that in his years away from the city, Caesar would initiate his transformation of the Roman Republic, starting with the conquer of a massive swathe of land, Gaul. When thinking about Caesar's conquest of Gaul, a lot of us will think about that one village of rebellious, potion-drinking Gauls surrounded by Roman garrisons. I am, of course, referring to Asterix and Obelix. While their depiction of the Gallic conquest and Caesar himself is hilarious, it is unfortunately not quite true. To be honest, many a village mightily resisted Caesar's advances, but unfortunately they ended up all in the same way, crushed under the Roman boots. What we know about the Gallic Wars comes almost exclusively from one single source, the De Bello Gallico, written by Julius Caesar himself. While nothing in it is outrageously made up or exaggerated, Caesar had written it so the people in Rome could know about his triumphs, so he couldn't really write up things he didn't do, since he had quite a lot of witnesses. Facts are skewered in Caesar's favour. Victories are exaggerated and defeats are glossed over. We've already seen how the entire expedition started when we talked about Divico, the chief of the Helvetii tribe, the one who had the goals of offending Caesar to his face. The conquest of Gaul, the Gallic Wars as they are known, lasted for 8 years more or less, from 58 to 50 BCE. And while they did give Caesar quite the fame, renown, and most importantly money, they are not the light-hearted adventures that the Asterix and Obelix comics seem to portray. The Romans were unmerciful, and Julius Caesar even less so. According to the man himself, he slayed more than 1 million Gauls, while suffering 0 losses. While the historians don't believe such obvious propaganda and exaggeration, still the Gallic Wars were exceptionally brutal, with an untold number of Gauls dead or taken prisoners, including many civilians. In the middle of his conquest of modern-day France, as he and his legions had arrived at what we would now refer as the Channel, Caesar decided to embark in the conquest of the land he could see on the other side of the strip of water, Britain. Though it was late in the season, being the end of August in the year 55 BCE, Caesar decided to try the crossing, taking just 2 legions with him. He probably tried to make a landing in Kent, at Ebbsfleet, north of Dover. Try being the operative word here, because as soon as the shore came in sight, Caesar also noticed the mass forces of the Britons waiting for the Romans to land. In the end, forced by time and tide, Caesar decided to risk the landing, but since the ships could not make it too close to the shores, the legionaries were left to disembark in the chalets and make it to the beach under enemy fire. It was understandably not an ideal situation, and many a legionary remained seated, waiting for a good moment. It had gotten to such a point that no one wanted to disembark anymore, until the standard-bearer of one of the legions just jumped into the water himself, shouting, "Leap, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, for my part, will perform my duty to the Republic and to my general." Losing the standard in combat was the greatest humiliation a legion could have, so the standard-bearer could not be allowed to fall, meaning that the entire legion jumped into the water after him to protect him and made it to shore. Even though in the end Caesar had gained the beachhead, he made no more progress than that, and with the winter coming, he had to retreat back to Gaul to regroup. He and his legions had narrowly avoided disaster, although no one could say that from the De Bello Gallico alone. On the contrary, Caesar had managed to spin this near miss into a great victory, which granted him, upon his return to Rome, an unprecedented 20 days Thanksgiving. With his appetite whetted by the new possibilities stretching before him, Caesar made preparation during winter for a second invasion in the spring of 54 BCE. In this case, he was more successful, managing a relatively easy beachhead and some conquests inland. In the end, though, despite all the propaganda and exaggerations, we can't say that Caesar conquered Britain, because it wouldn't be the truth. For a true conquer of the British Isle by the Romans we need to wait almost a century when the permanent conquest finally began by Emperor Claudius in 43 AD. Still, Caesar had gone further than any Roman before him and had been much more successful by far. His years outside of Rome had given him fame and glory, but things were about to take a turn, and not for the better. The first signal that something had started to go wrong was the death of his beloved daughter Julia. The wife of Pompey sadly passed away during childbirth, at barely 22, in the year 54 BCE. With her gone, the alliance binding her father to her husband started to crumble as well. It would not be long before the flames of Pompey's and Caesar's war engulfed the entire Rome. Caesar's conquest of Gaul had brought a lot to Rome and its people. The barbarians who had so terrorized the Romans in the past were finally quelled, the territory now a part of Rome itself. Of course, glory to Rome also meant glory to Caesar, the artifacts behind such a spectacular victory. Caesar had been missing from Rome for almost 10 years at this point, and it didn't even seem to want to come back. He simply was out there earning victory after victory and recounting those successes with flair and wit in the commentaries sent to the people, which we know now as the Bello Gallico. For that at the end of Caesar's first consulship the Senate had only been happy to see him gone, now after a decade of successes, the senators wanted him back in Rome, and fast, before he somehow ended up conquering something else. Caesar wasn't against coming back to Rome. After all, his main goal had always been a triumphant return into the city, but he wanted the honours that his decade abroad had won him. The Senate, though, especially Cato and Cicero, didn't seem particularly inclined to give them to him. They made it clear to Caesar that he was to be back, with no notion of triumph or even a second consulship. Yes, they were grateful, but they were sure that he'd done what he'd done for the grandeur of Rome, and not for his personal aggrandizement, right? Cato and the conservatives managed to recruit Pompey to their cause. The great Roman general, a former ally of Caesar himself, had watched his now bitter rival gain more and more glory, and such knowledge had left a bitter aftertaste in his mouth. Now that the last link between Pompey and Caesar was sadly gone, the former saw no reason to keep being the latter's ally. Moreover, in the year 53 BC, Crassus had died after a disastrous campaign in Syria against the Parthi, which, according to some legends, ended with him being dipped alive in gold. Nothing was left to keep the two generals together. While Caesar was marching towards Rome with his legion, now that this walk in Gaul was complete, Pompey had gone south to muster his own soldiers. Since the day of Romulus, the crossing of the Pomerium in arms carried the death penalty. Over the centuries, though, the borders had been expanded a little, so the rule had been modified. A general could not cross the borders of the home province without being invited by the Senate, and definitely not before having disbanded his legions. To do so would mean a declaration of war at Rome and the Senate. And so, still mindful of the laws, Caesar stopped at the Rubicon River with his legions near Rimini and waited for the Senate's invitation. When such an invite came, at the beginning of the year 49 BCE, it wasn't what Caesar had been expecting. The Senate had bid him to come, but it had also demanded that Caesar gave up his provinces and his armies. To do so, Caesar knew, would mean depriving himself of any protection, military or political, and thus being a sitting duck in the streets of Rome. It was as if he had gone back to being hunted through the marshes by Sulla's soldier. But Caesar was not a young boy anymore, and while he still had many friends to help him, he now also had an army. One he had no intention of disbanding. On January the 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar uttered the words "Alea jacta est," to die is cast, and crossed the Rubicon with his army, effectively declaring the start of the civil war. What followed were 5 years of bloodshed. Many of the senators had fled Rome in a panic when Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. Others had begged Pompey to help, promising him anything he wanted if he managed to defeat the hated upstart. If a bookmaker had given out odds at the beginning of the civil war, those would have definitely been in favour of Pompey. No one thought that Caesar and his ragtime army could win, especially not against a man who had been given the nickname Teenage Butcher for his ruthlessness. The first battle between the two, the Battle of Dyrrhachium, seemed to prove everybody's point when Caesar lost against Pompey. But then, a year later, in the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar won the day, and Pompey's army disintegrated. After such a defeat, Pompey fled towards Egypt, where, rather than the protection he had been seeking, he only found death. Many Pompeians surrendered after the battle, including Cicero and Marcus Junius Brutus, the young scion of the Brutus family, harking back to the first Brutus who founded the Republic, who was rumoured to be Caesar's own son. Others, like Cato, fought on, faithful to their principles until the very end, and many followed the honest senator's example and killed themselves on their swords. In the end, 5 years of war had only brought more death and instability in Rome. The civil war is one of the most commonly recognized endpoints of the Rome's Republic. The governing system which had saved Rome from a tyrant half a millennia before had grown weak and corrupted over the centuries, and it hadn't been able to stave off the rise of another dictator. Before we get to the end of the story, though, let's turn back the clock a little and step onto a little side path, without which Caesar's story would not be quite complete. When Caesar won the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE, it caused Pompey's army to disband and the general to flee to Egypt. At this point in time, Egypt was still a free reign under the sole control of the pharaohs. The great dynasties of the past had come and gone, and the land was now ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty. Much like what would happen centuries later in Europe with the Habsburg family, the Ptolemaic rulers had practiced interbreeding in an effort to keep the line pure. Brothers were married to sisters, and together they co-ruled Egypt. When Pompey fled to this country in 48 BC, the two very young rulers, Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII, were embroiled in a civil war, which had driven the queen out of her own country. To endear himself and his faction to the Romans, in the hope they would give him some help in driving Cleopatra away for good, Ptolemy had Pompey killed. When Caesar came to Egypt to enact his revenge and was given Pompey's head as proof of the deed, he wasn't happy. It's said that he even wept for the disgraceful fate that had befallen his longtime enemy. It was clear that Caesar had no intention of siding with Ptolemy and his faction, but now that he was on Egyptian soil, he was stuck there, prisoner of the pharaoh. Freedom came in the most unlikely way. Caesar had met but one of the official rulers of Egypt, since the other, Cleopatra, had been driven out of the country after having tried to take all the power for herself. Since Caesar hadn't sided with her brother, Cleopatra saw an opportunity for herself. Knowing that her brother would never allow her to meet with the Romans, she got creative and smuggled herself in. According to Plutarch, she ordered her servants to bind her in a bed sack, or roll her up in a carpet, depending on the version, and smuggle her inside the rooms where Caesar was kept. Cassius Dio is a bit more conservative in his story, and he simply writes that Cleopatra charmed Caesar when her brother wasn't in the palace. I prefer Plutarch's version, much like any filmmaker in the past 2 centuries, for it gives characters and grit to Cleopatra, a woman who was willing to do anything, murder not excluded, to rule over Egypt. However, the Queen of Egypt made her entrance, she left quite an impression. Despite the abundant age gap between them, he was 52 and she was 21 at the time, Caesar and Cleopatra entered an affair, which would last for some years and produce a son, Ptolemy Caesar, called Caesarion. Caesar would never recognize him as legitimate, though. The civil war had changed Caesar. Gone was the man trying to work within the boundary of the law and the traditional values. Caesar brought back Cleopatra to Rome, not in chains as part of triumph, like many foreign rulers had been, but as an honored guest, with her own villa and the possibility of entertaining her own guests. Many a traditional Roman was scandalized by such obvious flaunting of the ancient values. Caesar had no more time for these people. He had tried to reform Rome from within, but he had been thwarted at every possible occasion. It was now time to be a little more heavy-handed. Since the beginning of the war, when he had crossed the Rubicon in arms, Caesar had held the position of dictator. It hadn't been a permanent role yet, but he had engineered to be given the position on and off from 49 to 46 BCE, so he could carry out whatever reforms or appointments he needed to. According to the contemporary historians, though, these appointments were not legal in nature, but more of an honor title to recognize the immense power that Caesar already wielded. After 46 BCE, the appointment had become a yearly thing. With his victory over the last of the Pompeians and the massacre of those who hadn't wanted to yield to him, the Senate decided to shower Caesar with praise and honors, traditionally given to different people, but now concentrated in the hands of Caesar alone. He was also given a series of symbolic honors, like becoming the first living Roman to have his portrait on coins. He could wear a royal dress, sit in a golden chair in the Senate, and even erect statues of himself in temples. The name of the month in which he was born changed from Quintilis to Julius, now July. He recognized the calendar and erected temples to Venus, the mother of his line. Not everything Caesar did was good. Corruption ran rampant. Magistrates were bullied into giving up their positions. The Senate and the traditional values were ignored. Caesar was king in everything but name. In January 44 BCE, other attempts to call Caesar's Rex, king, were shut down by the tribunes of the plebs in front of a supporting crowd. Caesar had them deposed from office and expelled from the Senate, saying that in denying him the title, they had infringed upon his honor. This incident cost Caesar part of the love of the people. Undaunted, Caesar pursued perpetual dictatorship, obtaining it in February 44 BCE. It was clear for everyone that Caesar had no intention of restoring the Republic. He had amassed all the power in his hands. He talked like a king, acted like a king, dressed like a king. The only thing missing were the title and the crown. Soon after taking the role of perpetual dictator, Caesar was offered the crown, according to the sources. During the festival of the Lupercalia, Mark Antony offered Caesar a diadem, proclaiming him the new Romulus, the new king. Caesar refused it and offered it to Jupiter Optimus Maximus instead. This episode is controversial, not in the sense that it was invented by Shakespeare, for we have different Roman sources citing it, but because it's not clear whether or not Caesar was in the plot. Had this been solely Mark Antony's idea, and Caesar had not appreciated it, or had it been Caesar's test for the people? Maybe, if the applause had been more enthusiastic, he might have taken the crown. But as the people looked at him with worry, Caesar thought it best to just play it safe. It didn't really matter anymore. What was the use of refusing a crown when in every other aspect Caesar was the tyrannical king of the Roman past? It was all too much. The people's love for Caesar turned to hatred. It wasn't just because he had wanted to set himself up as king. Had this been his only sin, he might have been even forgiven. The real problem were his debt policies. He was too friendly to lenders. His use of lethal force to suppress protests. His reduction of the grain dole. His abolition of free elections, taking away the power of the people to express their opinion. Had Caesar been a benevolent king, maybe the people would have really given him the crown. There had been talks in the historian community that Caesar had been plagued by illness in the last year of his life. A malady that had changed him into a paranoid character, prone to senseless decisions. For centuries, historians had talked about epilepsy, although in much more recent times, there have also been talks of mini strokes affecting Caesar's brain and therefore judgment. Had the people known, would have changed anything? Probably not. If Caesar had really been sick, he should have retired from public life. Whether his actions had been sane or not, they still happened, and the people were not inclined towards forgiveness. The conspiracy to assassinate Caesar had started in the summer of 45 BCE, and by February 44 BCE, when Caesar had accepted perpetual dictatorship, they had collected more than 60 members. Interestingly enough, many conspirators had been on Caesar's side of the civil war, or had been pardoned by him at the end of it, like Marcus Junius Brutus, who now claimed the role of leader of the conspiracy by virtue of his descendants from Lucius Junius Brutus, who had driven out the last king, and Gaius Servilius Ahala, who had saved Rome from tyranny by killing Spurius Melius when he had rebelled against Cincinnatus. If you want to refresh their stories, go back at the beginning of this deep dive. A conspiracy this big could not be kept a secret forever, especially not when plans had to be scrapped and the date had to be moved back, since Caesar was about to depart for the Parthian Empire to avenge Crassus's death. The conspirators didn't have much time, so they decided the deed would be done in the middle of March, on the Ides, the last session of the Senate before Caesar's departure. Details of the conspiracy had leaked, enough that Caesar himself had been forewarned. The soothsayer Spurina had even told Caesar to beware that the omens were not in his favour. Shakespeare romanticized the warning by having Spurina single out the Ides of March, but in reality Caesar had been forewarned to beware for the entire month of March until his departure east. More than the animal entrails, Spurina had read the signs on the political arena. It didn't take a genius to know that Caesar had lost his touch. According to Plutarch, even Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had warned him to beware. The day of the assassination was to take place, the Ides of March as they are known. She had pleaded with her husband to stay home, because she had dreamt of bad things happening. And in truth, Caesar did heed the warning. He had meant to stay home that day. Maybe not to satisfy his wife, but because his health had taken a slight turn for ill. Whatever the reason, the conspirators had enough to panic about. If Caesar didn't turn up, their attempt would be bust. So they sent someone to go pick him up. And who better than a friend of Caesar? Decimus Brutus volunteered. We don't know his reasons for wanting Caesar dead, especially since he was his friend. But historians have posited that he had felt slighted by Caesar's refusal to grant him a triumph and a smooth political career. Decimus went and had to resort to mockery to get Caesar out of the house, but in the end he managed to persuade the dictator to get into a litter and be carried to the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate had taken to meeting while the Senate house was being rebuilt. As soon as Caesar dismounted and reached the stairs in front of the building, a lot of things happened at once. Many of the senators flocked to the dictator as if they needed to speak to him urgently. Someone did pass Caesar a piece of parchment, urging him to read it right away. It probably was a warning not to let anyone approach him. But historians tell us that Caesar carelessly put it in the folds of his toga without even glancing at it. Such behaviours, coupled with other instances in which Caesar had almost seemed to go out of his way not to protect himself, has made more than one historian theorize that either his illness had tampered with his judgment and the dictator thought himself immortal, or Caesar wanted to die. We will never know. It was the 15th of March, the Ides of March as the Romans called them. Caesar had been told to beware. Multiple omens had come out unlucky, and still the dictator had not taken heed. Apparently, upon seeing Spurina the soothsayer, Caesar is said to have told him, "The Ides of March have come," as if to remark that nothing had happened. Spurina, on his part, is said to have replied, "Aye, but they have not yet gone." We can't find words more prophetic than these. As Caesar took his customary golden sit, Lucius Stilius Cimber distracted him with a petition while the others got ready. When Caesar waved him away, Cimber grabbed his toga while Publius Servilius Casca took out a dagger and took a swipe at the dictator's neck. Caesar managed to dodge the first blow, but he was soon overcome as the rest of the conspirator descended on him. He was alone, for Mark Antony had been stalled, so he couldn't come to his aid. Would he have saved the dictator? We will never know. Caesar tried to disengage and went outside. As he turned to fight back, he tripped and fell down the stairs in front of the building, never to get up again. As he lay there defenseless, the conspirators rained blows on him until Caesar died of 23 stab wounds. Most of them had been given to a corpse, according to the autopsy. One of the very first blows had been the killing one. There's discord among the historians over Caesar's last words. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caesar did remark on Brutus's presence by saying in Greek, "You too, child." According to Plutarch, though, no sound passed the dictator's lips as he died. Gaius Julius Caesar was no more. As soon as the conspirators were sure of that fact, Brutus and the others went around Rome shouting, "People of Rome, we are finally free." I assume they all thought they were going to be praised. Maybe carried through the streets as the heroes they clearly thought they were. If so, they had miscalculated badly. The people of Rome did not rejoice. They instead locked themselves into their houses as soon as the news spread. Probably spooked by their reactions, the conspirators fled back to their houses. Caesar's corpse was left where it had fallen, until 3 servants picked him up and brought him back to the house. Caesar's death has unintended consequences. The conspirators had thought that by getting rid of him, things would go back to the way they used to be. But the reality was that Caesar's death precipitated the end of the Roman Republic. The lower classes had loved Caesar, even when he thought himself king, and they were unhappy that the upper echelons had sacrificed him. Mark Antony tried to capitalize on this anger, most probably to carve a position of power for himself. But Caesar had one last trick to play, even from beyond the grave. Rather than nominate Mark Antony as his heir, like everyone had expected, he had given all he had, including his legacy, to his grandnephew, the basically unknown Gaius Octavius. Overnight, a boy who would have had an eventful and obscure life became a Caesar, and with the name came also quite a sizable wealth. Gaius Octavius changed his name into Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian as we know him, later to become Augustus. He would be the one to see Caesar's dream come to fruition. He would finish the transition that his adoptive father had knowingly or unknowingly started. He would change the old and dusty republic into a bright, shiny and powerful empire. He would make the name Caesar a title, to bequeath to his descendants for centuries. So, who was Caesar? Was he trying to save the republic, or did he simply want to destroy it and remade in his image? Maybe he would have saved the republic, or he would have been the one to destroy it with his hands, after all. It's a tantalizing question, one which has brought forth scores of theories, but the truth is that we will never know. Maybe if Brutus and the others hadn't killed Caesar when they did, they would have profited from a Rome under the rule of the dictator. For sure, they might not have ended up dead. I will leave the question here for you, my fellow travellers. Now that the path of Gaius Julius Caesar is done, what do you think? Was he a saviour or a destroyer? And so it ends. Both our deep dive into Roman history and the first season of the podcast are complete. I, for one, look forward to a bit of peace and leisure so I can come back, recharged and ready to tackle the path of history once again. You have not seen the last of me, don't worry. There's another project brewing, and I will share all the details and some backstage spoilers on my Instagram channel, The Apple and the Hero. Join me there for a new adventure. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.